StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
Let's once again remember that day when Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, gave order that Jesus should die by the cross. The Roman soldiers then took Jesus and beat him again most cruelly, and then they led him out of the city to the place where he was to be crucified. This was a place called Golgotha in the Jewish language, Calvary in that of the Romans, both words meaning the place of the skull. With the soldiers went out of the city a great crowd of people, some of them enemies of Jesus, who were glad to see him suffer. Others of them were friends of his, and the women who had helped him, now weeping as they saw him covered with his own blood and knowing that he was going out to die. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when they shall count those happy who have no little ones to be slain, when they'll wish that the mountains might fall on them and the hills might cover them and hide them from their enemies." Continuing with our series on the life of Christ, this story from the Bible is titled, "The Darkest Day of All the World."
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family because it's time for this week's Bible Story.
They had tried to make Jesus bear his own cross, but soon found that he was too weak from his sufferings and couldn't carry it. They seized a man who was coming out of the country into the city, a man named Simon, and they made him carry the cross to his place at Calvary. It was a custom among the Jews to give to men who were about to be crucified some medicine to deaden their feelings so that they wouldn't suffer so greatly. They offered this to Jesus, but when he had tasted it and found what it was, he wouldn't take it. He knew that he was going to die, but he wished to have his mind clear and to understand what was done and what was said, even though his sufferings might be greater. At the place called Calvary, they laid the cross down and they stretched Jesus out on it and nailed him to it. They drove nails through his hands and through his feet to fasten him to the cross. And then they stood the cross upright with Jesus nailed to it. And while the soldiers were doing this dreadful work, Jesus prayed for them. He prayed to God and said, "Father, forgive them because they know not what they're doing." The soldiers also took the clothes that Jesus had worn, giving to each one a garment. But when they came to his undergarment, they found that it was woven and had no seams. So they said, "Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who shall have it." So at the foot of the cross, the soldiers threw lots for the garment of Christ. Two men who had been robbers and had been sentenced to die by the cross were led out to die at the same time with Jesus. One was placed on a cross on his right side and the other on his left. And to make Jesus appear as the worst, his cross stood in the middle. Over the head of Jesus on his cross, by order of Pilate, they placed a sign on which was written, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And this was written in 3 languages: in Hebrew, which was the language of the Jews, in Latin, the language of the Romans, and in Greek, a language read by many people throughout the world at that time. Many of the people read this writing, but the chief priests weren't pleased with it, and they urged Pilate to have it changed from "the King of the Jews" to "He said, I'm the King of the Jews." But Pilate wouldn't change it. He said, "What I've written, I have written." And the people who passed by on the road as they looked at Jesus hanging there on the cross, they mocked at him, and some called out to him, "You that would destroy the temple and build it back again in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." And the priests and scribes said, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Come down from the cross, and we'll believe in you." And one of the robbers, who was on his own cross beside that of Jesus, joined in the cry and said, "If you're Christ, save yourself and save us." But the other robber said to him, "Have you no fear of God to speak like this while you're suffering the same fate with this man? And you and I deserve to die, but this man's done nothing wrong." And then this man said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom." And Jesus answered him as they were both hanging on their crosses, "Today you shall be with me in heaven." There before the cross of Jesus stood his mother, filled with sorrow for her son, and beside her was one of his disciples, John, the one whom he loved best. Other women besides his mother were there. His mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and a woman named Mary Magdalene, out of whom a year before Jesus had sent an evil spirit. Now that he was leaving her, Jesus wished to give his mother into the care of John. And as he looked from her to John, he said to her, "Woman, see your son." And then to John he said, "Son, see your mother." And on that day, John took the mother of Jesus home to his own house and cared for her as his own mother. At about noon, a sudden darkness came over the land and lasted for 3 hours. And in the middle of the afternoon, when Jesus had been on the cross 6 hours in terrible pain, he cried out aloud words which meant, "My Lord, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Words which are the beginning of the 22nd Psalm. And this is a psalm which long before had spoken of many of Christ's sufferings. After this he spoke again, saying, "I'm thirsty." And someone dipped a sponge in a cup of vinegar and put it on a reed and held it up to him to drink. And then Jesus spoke his last words on the cross. "It is finished. Father, into thy hands I give my spirit." And then he died. And at that very moment, the veil of the temple between the holy place and the Holy of Holies was torn apart by unseen hands from the top to the bottom. And the Roman officer who had charge of the soldiers around the cross saw what had taken place and how Jesus died, and he said, "Truly, this was a good man. He was the Son of God." After Jesus was dead, one of the soldiers, to be sure that he was dead, ran his spear into the side of his dead body, and out came pouring both blood and water. Even among the rulers of the Jews, there were a few who were friends of Jesus, although they didn't dare to follow him openly. One of these was Nicodemus, the ruler who came to see him at night. Another was a rich man who came from the town of Arimathea, and whose name was Joseph. Joseph of Arimathea went boldly into Pilate and asked that the body of Jesus might be given to him. Pilate wondered that he had died so soon, for often men lived on the cross 2 or 3 days, just hanging there and suffering. But when he found that Jesus was really dead, he gave his body to Joseph. And then Joseph and his friends took down the body of Jesus from the cross and wrapped it in fine linen, and Nicodemus brought some precious spices, myrrh and aloes, which they wrapped up with the body for anointing. And then they placed the body in Joseph's own tomb, a new tomb, which was a cave dug out of the rock in a garden near the place of the cross. And in front of the opening of the cave, they rolled a huge stone. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and some other women saw the tomb and watched while they laid the body of Jesus in it. And on the next morning, some of the rulers of the Jews came to Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that man Jesus of Nazareth, who deceived the people, said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I'll rise again.' So we ask that you give orders that the tomb be watched and made sure for 3 days, or else his disciples may come and steal his body and then say he's risen from the dead. And thus, even after his death, he may do more harm than he did while he was alive." Pilate said to him, "Set a watch and make it as sure as you can." Then they placed a seal on the stone so that no one might break it, and they set a watch of soldiers there at the door. And in the tomb, the body of Jesus lay from the evening of Friday, the day when he died on the cross, to the dawn of Sunday, the first day of the week.
Precious memories, unseen angels, sent from somewhere to my soul.